Next, a glimpse inside the glamour and the intensity of glossy magazine production in its heyday. Graydon Carter was the editor of Vanity Fair for 25 years, and in his new memoir, he reflects on his career adventures. He tells Walter Isaacson about the golden age of magazines and how he made it to the top from his humble beginnings.
Thank you, Chris John and Graydon Carter. Welcome to the show.
Walter, thank you.
You know, one of the things we biographers sometimes think about is that it's all about dad when it's a successful person. And then I'm reading this book, and your father is quite a character. Tell me, let's start there. Tell me about him.
Well, he was a pilot during World War II and flew Spitfires and Lancasters. He did not have what you would call a mind for business and had a business that did not do well after the war, but he loved flying, and he loved flying and sailing and skiing and golf. And he was, he was a character, and he loved wood. And he would take my brother and I, we were like, like 9 and 5 out to look for wood on the side of the road that the National Commission, Capital Commission, which was in Ottawa, where we grew up in, would go out there to get free firewood. He was quite cheap and would turn the thermostat down to 45 degrees a night. This is in a city where it would easily be 30, 40 below at night.
And so you actually worked as a lumberjack on lines. Tell me about some of those jobs and how that affected how you hired people when you got to be rich and famous.
Well, I never got to be rich and famous, but it did affect the way I hired people. My parents, like a lot of their friends, sent their kids out west to toughen them up and to, if you could, get a job as a lineman for the railroad. And then I went out and worked for 6 months for the Canadian National Railroad out on the Saskatchewan prairie. I lived in a boxcar with 11 other guys. Most of them had minor criminal records. They'd had a spot of trouble when they were growing up. And I overcame my fear of heights and learned how to climb telegraph poles. And I had one of the most great experiences of my life. And I adored all the guys I worked with. And so when I hired people, especially assistants when they're young, rather than sort of silver-plated internships, I looked for people who've worked in restaurants or worked at a dude ranch or done something with their hands. And I do think that if you're a waiter or waitress and you can handle 3 or 4 tables of 6 or 8 difficult diners, everything else in life is going to come easy.
You and I joined Time together and probably talk about when the going was good. Tell me about your first few months at Time when we were there.
Well, I mean, I arrived from Canada. It was in the fall, but it was still warm, and I only had really warm clothing coming from Canada. I had an old blazer with a crest on it, and I wore it to a meeting, and somebody at the meeting asked if I worked as a doorman, and so I was sort of slightly horrified. So I went back that night, and I, with a razor blade, sewed the label, the crest off of my jacket. And it left a sort of a dark patch because the rest of the jacket had faded, and I looked even more foolish. But it was exhilarating for me. I mean, the rest of you guys, I mean, all of you, were incredibly talented and much smarter than the people I'd been around.
Tell me about that team that you came in with at Time.
Well, it was you. It was Kurt Anderson, who became my partner at SPY. It was Michiko Kakutani, became a Pulitzer Prize winner and chief book critic of the New York Times. Maureen Dowd, a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic for the Times. There was Pico Iyer, the wonderful writer. There was Jim Kelly, who became the editor of Time. There was Rick Stengel, who became the editor of Time. There was Steve Smith, who became the editor of U.S. News and World Report. Who am I missing here? Frank Rich, who became the chief theater critic for the Times.
I always thought that you were the consummate insider and also outsider. You could play both roles. Did you feel that way at Time?
No, I felt like an outsider, but I was dying to get into the melting pot and just melt. I tried to get rid of my Canadianisms. I tried to dress like an American, and I just wanted to sort of fit in with all you.
One of the subtitles for this book could have been Expense Accounts I Have Known. Tell me about your expense account at Time.
Well, it was the same as yours, and the fact is I'd never had one before, and to be in your 20s, paying $200 a month rent in New York, and having an expense account. I felt like I was in heaven, and I didn't cook a meal for the first 5 years. I don't think I turned on my oven once. I don't think I knew how to turn on my oven. And so to be able to go to restaurants, and I remember in those days you rarely went out for lunch with one or two people that you didn't split a bottle of wine. And to me, it was just absolute nirvana.
Was there something profligate about that we should have reined back, knowing that it was going to be difficult in the future?
Oh, God, no. It wouldn't have changed a thing. First of all, I think the expenses were such a small line item in the overall cost of putting out time. No, I think that is an important element in maintaining staff and keeping staff happy and committed. I mean, then I went to Condé Nast, where the expenses were exponentially greater. But Cy Newhouse, who ran Condé Nast, he wasn't just throwing the money out the window. He wanted to make Condé Nast the dominant magazine publisher in America, and he did.
And he did it by spending money even on like Annie Leibovitz, which helped define your Vanity Fair's look and feel.
100%. I mean, she was our principal photographer. And I remember one time we were $250,000 away from what she wanted for her contract and what we wanted to pay her. And I mentioned this to Cy, and he just said, "Oh, let's pay it." He said, "I don't want to nickel and dime her."
I love it when nickel and diming is referred to as $250,000 a year. So tell me about when you were at Time. I used to walk down the halls and I'd see you and Kurt huddled together, and you were inventing Spy magazine. What was going through your head? Why did you decide, okay, we want to get out of Time and invent a new form of magazine?
Well, everybody else at the magazine seemed to be doing very well, and I knew that I wasn't cut out to be Time material. So
why is that?
I just wasn't. I wasn't Ivy League. I wasn't as buttoned down. I wasn't as good a writer, and so I could sort of read the writing on the wall, and I thought I had this idea for a magazine, and then I approached Jim Kelly first, but I think he knew he was going to be the editor at one point. And then I approached Kurt, and he was in right away. And so that over a 10-month period, we planned out the entire magazine.
Well, but you said you had an idea for a magazine. I love Spy, but tell me, what was the idea behind it?
It was just a funny, satirical, fact-based magazine about New York City, which was then, as you know, it had come out of bankruptcy or near bankruptcy. It was all of a sudden there was awash with this new money coming from investment bankers. Their wives were the ladies who lunched, and the city was sort of alive with a lot of characters showing off the money they had, and that's sort of great for journalism. And we wanted to write about that.
And it was basically poking fun at the pretensions of this elite, like in the tradition of H.L. Mencken and way back on magazines. Tell me let's start with Donald Trump. How did he get to be a stubby-fingered vulgarian?
Not stubby, short-fingered.
Short-fingered vulgarian.
He'd be offended by stubby.
Oh, yes, exactly. We don't want to offend him.
As he is by short. No, I was always in need of money because I had a number of kids, and so I took an assignment from GQ to write a story about him, and it was his first national exposure. So I spent 3 weeks with him, and he was very excited to have me around. And to be honest, I found him charming in a salesman type way. He uses your name like every 3 or 4 sentences, the way a tin aluminum siding salesman would use it. But in the story, I'd made the mention that I thought his hands looked too small for his body. So at Spy magazine later on, we came up with epithets for people, and we called him a short-fingered vulgarian that truly drove him crazy.
And how did Donald Trump react over the years on the short-fingered vulgarian? He sent you missives at times.
Well, firstly, he would send me nasty notes. Then he threatened to sue us. Then when I became the editor of Vanity Fair, the transactional Donald Trump, I think he realized he better calm this feud, such as it was, down. And we tried to become, he tried to become friends, and we had dinner at Mar-a-Lago. I've had dinner with him and Melania. He invited me to one of his weddings, but it just couldn't hold. And so I would write something about him in Vanity Fair, and he would, once Twitter got started, he started tweeting horrible things about me. He would call me sloppy and dopey. He said my wife thought I was a total loser. He said the Vanity Fair was losing steam. The Oscar party wasn't hot. The food at our restaurant, the Waverly Inn, was terrible. And I blew up all these tweets about this large, and I framed them and had them all up inside my wall for visitors to see when they came to visit me.
You talk about him being transactional, that even though you had poked fun of him once you were powerful, he was trying to make it up. That's a theme of this book, too, whether it's Michael Ovitz or Donald Trump, all these people you pilloried when you were at Spy, they then all want to be transactional and make it up to you.
That was simply because of the chair I was sitting in at Vanity Fair. I think it was very important to them. And, I did my best to give them a fair shake, but Mike Ovitz was, then the most powerful man in Hollywood, and he had a dramatic fall. And we did 2 or 3 stories on that. And I always used to say the Vanity Fair was the magazine that if you rose to success, it'd be the magazine you'd want to have that story written about. And if you fell from those heights, it's the least favorite magazine you'd want to have written about.
How did the Vanity Fair job come along?
I had, there was an intermediate period between Spy and Vanity Fair, and I edited this newspaper called the New York Observer. And it was a very sleepy Upper East Side newspaper. It was a broadsheet on salmon-colored paper. It was very well designed. But I took the job, and I thought I could make it a thing at a certain point, like readable, and then at some point a must read. And about 7 months in, I started sending complimentary copies to friends of mine that I'd met over the years, and to a lot of them, there were editors in Europe. And Cy takes an annual tour of all his properties in Europe.
This is Cy Newhouse, who runs Condé Nast.
Who owned Condé Nast and Vanity Fair and the New Yorker. And he stopped off in London and Paris and Milan, and he saw copies of the New York Observer in everybody's in basket, and returned to America under the misguided impression that this was an international hit. So he called me in and he asked if I would be interested in 2 magazines. And I thought he was going to say something like GQ or Details, neither of which I could improve on. And he offered me either the New Yorker or Vanity Fair. And we had spent 5 years making fun of the writing style, the editor, the contributors at Vanity Fair. And so we settled on the New Yorker. And I'd spent the next 2 weeks working out a plan. I only told Jim Kelly, my agent Andrew Wiley, and my family about this. And the day that it was supposed to be announced, Anna Wintour called me and said, it's going to be the other magazine. And I thought, oh God, I don't have a plan for that. But I said, I'll take the job, because we desperately needed the extra money. And the first 2 years were rocky, because the people at the magazine, I don't think they fully trusted me because of Spy, but I thought if I just be myself and treat them fairly and compassionately, it'll work out. And I went 2 years without firing anybody. And in 1 week, I let 3 people go, which was more people than I'd let go fired in my entire life. And then things sort of changed. People started coming around to the way I wanted the magazine to be. And we tried to change the house style of writing. And I wanted people to work together in a collegial, a friendly, respectful manner. And for the next 23 years, it pretty much was that.
And you had some of the best writers in the business, and you just kind of recruited big names and gave them long form. Tell me about some of them.
Well, I went after writers. I wanted clever writers like Christopher Hitchens and James Walcott to be columnists, but I also wanted writers who could write big narrative stories that had a beginning, middle, and end, and they could run between 8,000 words and 20,000 words, but they had to be able to tell a story. So I had people like, Michael Hare and David Halberstam and Sebastian Junger
And Michael Lewis and
Michael
Brian
Lewis and Maureen Orth and Marie Brenner. It was and eventually we had about 50 writers on contract.
Why is that desire for brilliant long-form narrative fallen out?
It hasn't. It's just so expensive because I should have thrown Brian Burrow in there as well. It's just so expensive because a writer has to spend, 3 months, sometimes half a year on a story, and they've got to make a living, and we could afford to pay them during that period. Like when Dominic Dunn, he spent almost a year in Los Angeles covering the O.J. Simpson trial, and it was a big thing for Vanity Fair. He was a huge star, and that probably cost us $1 million a year or more for those stories.
Your relationship with Anna Wintour is carefully woven through the book. Tell me about her.
Okay, first of all, we were very good friends. I wrote for her for a number of years. She introduced me to Cy. She brought me into Condé Nast. She was a great and sort of cozy colleague, and we had a very good relationship. She got I think she started living up to a nuclear winter reputation. I didn't find that to be the case until much later in our relationship. But then eventually she became a little unpredictable when I met her, and I've said this in my book, but I was never sure when I saw her whether she'd treat me like one of her best friends or the parking lot attendant. And so when she became the editor-in-chief of Condé Nast, she made an attempt to try to take over half my staff and put them under her. And that sort of put a chill on the relationship, and it put a chill on my time at Condé Nast. I was coming up to my 25th year at Vanity Fair, and I thought it's time to do something different.
Graydon Carter, thank you so much for joining us.
Walter, thank you.
Now, hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, mostly around controversial aid distribution sites, including scores today, according to officials there. And with attention turned to Iran, their plight risks, in fact, is being forgotten. And many are warning that the conflict threatens to erase Palestinian history, culture, and identity, meaning storytelling itself becomes a form of survival. Our next guest, the Palestinian-American writer Hala Alyan, is doing what she can to preserve that. Her new memoir, I'll Tell You When I'm Home, is an exploration of motherhood, exile, and her own family's displacement during the 1948 Nakba. Alyan is joining Michelle Martin to discuss how the stories we inherit shape the ones we tell.
Thanks, Christiane. Hala Alyan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are a woman of many lives. You are a clinical psychologist. You are a poet. You are the author of many beautiful essays that just sort of touch people to their core. This book, it's a memoir, but I also read it in part. Some of it reads like poetry. Some of it, they're like prose poems. Some of it is a history lesson. How do you describe it?
It's a good question. I think in some ways a poet is constantly giving themselves away, where like the poetic fingerprints are kind of on everything I touch. I conceptualize the world through in all the different things that I do, sort of through the prism of fragmentation. I'm really interested in what we do with parts in general as people, which tracks with being a psychologist, it tracks with being a writer. It just kind of really thinking about how we can take all of these different things that can feel incredibly incoherent, that oftentimes do feel incoherent for us in the present. And then through the act of making and remaking and creating, something starts to emerge. And so I think this book really is kind of a testament to that making that I was doing, and that sort of fumbling in the dark that I was doing in my psyche, through history, through conceptualizations of fertility, the body, land, exile, displacement. It's archive, it's memory, it's dream work. I mean, it's all of those things.
Well, the thing about this book, it braids together some of the most profound experiences that any human being can have. The experience of infertility, the experience of difficulties in marriage, but also the experience of displacement. I mean, you're Palestinian. This is something that you've written about. You've written about the experience of people who have been displaced through decades, across continents, and trying to figure out where you fit in the world. What made this the time to write this book?
I think, it's interesting because this book was written pre-October 7th because the editing process, et cetera, you give it to publication. And while I was doing the edits, one of the questions that I had was, is this still going to be relevant? The urgency of the moment right now of everything we're seeing in Gaza and elsewhere I feel so completely compelled to put everything down and just speak about that and just be writing about that. It was one of those queries I had for myself during the editing process of, do we now scrap this? Do we write towards a different ending? Do we, the storyline as it is in the book ends in 2022 with the birth of my daughter. Do we now write a completely different thing? Do we add an afterword? Do we whatever? And one of the things that was really striking about it was that in the end, it all remained relevant because I had been writing Palestine throughout it, and writing, to your point, the experience of exile and displacement. And there's a way in which you kind of don't know the water you're swimming in because you're constantly swimming in it. That I felt like there was something I needed to do that was more pronounced with the narrative, when in fact it's everything that I'm touching, it's everything that I'm thinking about and has been for my entire life. And so, for me, the necessity of this particular narrative for this story is frankly that I just couldn't get the narrative or the story to work in any other form.
I'm going to edit what I said earlier. I said you're Palestinian American, or you're an American Palestinian. I don't know, however you sort of hear it in your own mind.
Yeah,
right. Briefly, would you just describe your roots?
Yeah, so I was born to Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese immigrants. So my parents met and married in Kuwait. My mother's background is Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian a little bit. My dad was born in Gaza after his family left a village that was eradicated in 1948 called Iraq Sweden. So they met in Kuwait. I was born in the States. We were in the States very briefly after my birth and then went back to Kuwait. We were there until Saddam's invasion in 1990, then precipitated our needing to seek asylum, or I had a passport, but my parents then sought asylum in the States. So then we lived in the Midwest until I was about 12. And then I moved back to the Middle East. From 12 to 22, I lived in the Arab world. And I did my high school in Lebanon. I did my undergrad in Beirut, and then came to New York for grad school and have been there since.
You've been there since, but also your family's never left you. They're still with you. You're carrying them with you, right?
Oh, yeah. I think that's the really interesting experience of diaspora in so many ways, is that you're kind of this like not quite there-ness and in-betweenness that so many people have talked and written about across, centuries. Is one of the consequences of that is that you're kind of always in a place and you're never in a place at the same time. And you're always sort of amassing and regathering different, markers that feel like home. So yeah, absolutely. One of them is it's the family never leaves you, but I think it's also just the stories don't leave you. The memory, you become the holder of memories in different ways, and you become the archive in different ways.
Well, the great African-American, writer, sociologist, scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about that in the African-American experience of the two-ness.
Exactly.
The two warring souls in one dark body. But in your case, the two warring souls are at times countries that are literally at war with each other. And then you talk about the war with your body, not doing what it is that you so want it to do.
Right.
And that is a very interesting thing to sort of compare that to that experience of war. You talk about being exiled from motherhood as something that you so very much want, but are longing for, but is eluding you. And I just think that's quite remarkable. And so that's where I want to ask you to read a passage for us. And it's written as a kind of, it's written as sort of a address to your daughter. So would you read a bit for us?
In you is the glittering Beirut pavement after rain, the ports of Boston. In you are both my grandmother's rebellious blood, following men, escaping wars from one country to another, my mother's leavings, my aunts, the rage and humiliation and exile. In you is the harm and rejoicing and help of generations of women. In you live the people that made you, all of them. I wouldn't give you another story even if I could, for this is the one that bore you, and it is heavy and dazzling, and the truth in you is your father's wanderlust, his father's loneliness, his father's heart giving out on the marble floor. In you is the story of sailors, occupiers, the occupied, the people who never left, and the people who were made to. You will learn to live within this, as we all do. You come from people that love the way moons pull tides, or else the way tides are pulled by the moon, and someday you will have to reckon with your own unruly heart. I have no advice to give, save one thing. Don't exile anything. Turn the sun of your attention briefly, sometimes briefly, on all that awakens your love. This is your birthright, Veda. You will have to hunt for many things, excavate them in others or yourself, but not your mother's truth. I'll leave that right in the open for you to see.
There's so much here. It's not uniquely women, but it is often women who are sort of asked to choose one or the other, you know, the personal or the political, right? You're asked to think about the world, or you're asked to think about the home, or you're within your what's within you. And what you're saying here is, I refuse.
Right.
I refuse to choose. It's all within us. But the other passage here that really, really sort of struck me is, in you is the story of sailors, occupiers, the occupied, the people who never left, the people who were made to. You will learn to live within this, as we all do. Do you, though? Do we all live with this?
I know what you're saying. Like, there's a specific experience that's being evoked here. I mean, I think that's sort of one of the things about writing, is how to live alongside the particular and the universal, and how to to lean into the specificity. And oftentimes, in leaning to the specificity, you're calling for something that people can see themselves in. I think we all live within contradictions. I think we all have to make sense of what we inherit and what we would want to leave behind, whether or not we are mothers or caregivers or whatever in those traditional senses. I think we all hopefully are on this planet to think of ways to show up for each other and care for each other. And I think to do that is to think of the legacy that we come from and the legacy we'll leave behind.
So Hala, after all of this very real experience of moving from place to place, and also the meditation on moving from place to place, what does home mean to you now?
It's a beautiful question. I think on one hand, certainly home, as for many people in diaspora communities, has come to mean the idea of the perpetual hope for return. And in my case, to be able to bring my daughter freely to places in Palestine, to places in Lebanon, to places in Syria, so that she's able to access her ancestry. She's able to access her birthright. I think until that is possible, for me, in this present moment, home has come to mean the people that I feel in community with, the people that I know see me and that I can see with sort of love, with affection, with warmth, and with wholeness, to be able to really allow for kind of all the contradictory parts of our identities, our histories, to show up fully. And so it's come to mean really more concept and personhood, and like how we show up with each other. It's become a far more intangible thing. I think for a long time I was really preoccupied with the idea of physical place, and how I could evoke it in my writing, and how I could write towards it, and with the rhetoric around it and whatnot. I think that while so many of those things continue to be important, in the meantime, it's been finding people who see the world in similar ways as me, and being able to think of ways to raise my daughter I want a home, and that is to say a future, and that is to say a world that is better for her than the one that I'm in right now.
Can I read one passage that struck me? It's early-ish in the book. You were able to have your daughter. She is here, but after many trials and a lot of interventions and some heartbreaking miscarriages and painful experience, and you were able to have her through surrogacy. And so I just want to say that, because this is how we help to set up this passage I want to read. This story is about waiting. I was terrible at waiting, but used to it, or so I'd thought. But those pink lines meant a different kind of waiting. Suddenly, waiting had a purpose, a goal. The waiting became tolerable because ostensibly it had an ending. I'd become consumed with leavings, Johnny's, my body's, death, the way places became inaccessible with what wouldn't stay. No bulldozer cleaved my life in two. It had been just one noiseless departure after the other. And beneath that pulsing loss, an echo of all the vanishings and takings that had come before. But now there is something coming. There is a waiting that matters, how I use my time, what amends I make, the stories I gather, what I'll tell you and how, stories of the people you'll never know, of the places of love and wreckage in equal measure. My entire life, I hungered for stories more than anything else. The story inside each war, each arrival. I'd lie in bed as a child and imagine myself a time traveler, returning to my mother's childhood, my grandmother's youth, back even farther, all the women and houses and births and burials, the prayers, the wedding ceremonies, the armies. I was determined of one thing. I'd put my waiting to good use. That's sort of a testimony about story and the importance, of story. And now that you've told this story, I want to ask, do you feel a wholeness now?
Wholeness is a big word. I think I feel a sense of completion in terms of having tried to tell the story that I was trying to tell. And I think one of the things that I've learned about writing or studying narrative kind of more on a socio-political level is that it's never done. I do feel like I told the story that I wanted to tell. And I think the timing of it, when this book is being released is really heart-wrenching, in that it's a book about really my experience of motherhood and surrogacy and all those years of infertility has shown me just the absolute value of a life and the pressure of a life and what one can undertake to bring a life into this world. And to sort of compare that to the absolute devastation and disregard for life that we're seeing, that I think has been, it's an interesting time to be launching the book, to be really thinking about what it means to be writing about having brought in many ways, like a half Palestinian child to this world. And to think about how, I do not believe art is a replacement for, policy or the changes that need to happen on the ground. But I do think there's something about, I have come to understand narrative making as one of the most powerful tools of reclaiming and return, as I read in the past, return even in imagination, because I do think there's something that we see where power often decides when a story begins, so power, people of power. One of the biggest receipts of that power usually is the ability to say, we press the take here, we press start here, we press pause here. And to shape a beginning is oftentimes to shape an ending. And so I think in some ways, when so much effort is put towards destroying archive, that does indicate to me that the archive is actually quite important. That includes Palestinian voices, it includes voices of anybody that's belongs to a marginalized, oppressed community. So I think in that way, it's I do feel a sense of completion. And I also feel like this hopefully is the beginning for myself and for many other people to really continue to tell the stories of how we get here and how we stay here.
Do you have a sense of who you would like to find this book?
I think certainly on one level, anybody who is, interested, seeking, questioning motherhood. And again, I mean that sort of in an ungendered sense, right? Caregiving, of showing up for that task in some way. Certainly people who have been struggling or have struggled with infertility. And I think also folks who are just kind of interested in the idea of surrogacy as metaphor too, because I certainly talk about it in this literal sense, but I also am really interested in the idea of surrogacy as symbolism for the ways that we care for each other and we show up for each other, because it's really kind of like the most it's an extreme example of what I think we are doing for each other, hopefully on a day-to-day basis. And then I think anyone who has belonged to an identity or community that's facing and has faced erasure, I think this book is a way of trying to counter that and write against that.
Hala Ayam, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
If I were to pose a question about significant figures in Russian history, who would spring to mind? You might think of well-known leaders like Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, or President Putin. But how many of you could name the women who stood alongside them? A new book written by our next guest, Russian-American writer Julia Ioffe, confronts the forgotten narratives of these women and places their remarkable stories in the spotlight. Ioffe joins Michel Martin to discuss Russia's complex history of motherhood, marriage, and much more.
Thanks, Christiane. Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Your new book, Motherland, is so interesting. It looks through modern Russian history, Soviet and Russian history, but through the lens of the women. How did you get the idea to do that?
Well, the first germ of the idea was to write a book that wasn't about Vladimir Putin. I was so tired of talking about him, writing about him, thinking about him, and I wanted to write a book about Russia that wasn't about him. And then I realized I wanted it to not be about most of the men that we read so much about. The Vladimir Lenins, the Joseph Stalins, the Nikita Khrushchevs. And then the other part of the idea came from the fact that I was constantly having to explain to American friends, to Western friends, why it was so normal for women like my great-grandmothers to be doctors in the 1930s and scientists. And something that seemed completely extraordinary to them was totally ordinary to me. And so to bridge that gap, I realized I had to tell the story of the whole thing.
You write about this extraordinary social revolution that followed 1917. Soviet women were, quote, given the right to higher education, equal pay, no-fault civil divorce, child support, including for children born out of wedlock, paid maternity leave, and access to free maternity hospitals. And in 1920, the Soviet Union legalized abortion. How did that happen?
Well, the new Soviet authorities, the Bolshevik authorities, wanted to emancipate women, and they wanted to destroy the bourgeois family, which they felt imprisoned women. It was part of their project to remake society, starting from the individual, to remake a Soviet person. And if you think about where they were coming from, in the 19th century, women married mostly for economic reasons, right? They went from their father's house to their husband's house, and it was impossible to get out of that out of that marriage, even if there was abuse or cheating, or she just didn't want to be married to him anymore. There was nowhere to go. Women were expected to, working class women were expected to work through their pregnancies and come right back right after giving birth, right? I mean, you don't even have to think about the 19th century, right? We're still fighting for these rights here today, 100 years later.
I feel sort of embarrassed that I didn't know some of these names. Everybody knows Lenin. But who was Alexandra, how am I say it correctly, Kollontai?
Yeah, that's right.
Who was she? And tell us why she was such an important figure.
So she became an ally of Vladimir Lenin, and she voted with him in the Bolshevik Central Committee to seize power in October 1917, for which she was rewarded with a cabinet ministerial post. So she became the first female cabinet minister in history. But she was a writer and a thinker that really fleshed out the ideas of how to emancipate women specifically. Marxist writers, most of the men, wrote about how to get rid of capitalism, get rid of private property, and how this would just emancipate everyone. And Kollontai said, well, no, women do have specific needs. She wrote that the most important thing for a woman, the thing that gave her meaning in life and gave her purpose on this earth, wasn't getting married, wasn't having children, but her own work, her own creative labor. And she could get married if she wanted to. She could not. She could have a fling or an affair to drink from the cup of love until she was sated, as Kollontai wrote, and then get back to work. She wrote that in 1913. I think that is still a very controversial and radical statement today.
So I was fascinated by Raisa Gorbachev because, a lot of Americans had seen her because she traveled here with her husband. Just talk a little bit about her.
Raisa didn't really fit in at home. Soviets really hated her. They didn't like that she was so independent. They didn't like that she was one of her husband's closest advisors. She helped him write his speeches. She was with him on foreign trips everywhere. It was really jarring for Soviets to see her when they had been used for decades to seeing only old male faces at the top. She was stylish and kind of running around the world at a time when Soviet women couldn't find clothes or food to eat. They didn't have menstrual products. They didn't have bras. They gave birth in filthy conditions in these maternity hospitals that were just horrific, as I describe in the book. And they certainly couldn't travel abroad the way she did. And she enchanted a lot of people in the West, including American feminists who said, "Oh, look at her! She's this amazing working woman who has it all. She's a wife, a mother, a grandmother, as well as a college professor, a PhD, and she's still so feminine. You know, how does she do it?" Where Soviet women were like, our lives look nothing like hers, and we hate her for rubbing it in our faces.
Then we get to Putin. And I know you said you didn't want the book to be about Putin. It's not, but it's about because he does take up a lot of space. That was one of the most depressing chapters where you about why they dated for years before they actually married, which is unusual at the time. And he kind of made it clear that, she was there to kind of be his administrative officer and raise the kids and do whatever, but didn't give her any kind of support or affection from what we see at all. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about her?
So Lyudmila Putina, who is now Lyudmila Chiretna, because she's done okay. She's married a man 10 years her junior. For her silence, she has gotten lots and lots of money. She has mansions all over Europe, including Belarus. Okay. She's doing fine.
Okay.
But Lyudmila Putina was born in Kaliningrad, which is kind of this outcropping of Russia in the middle of Europe. And she had an alcoholic father. She lived in a communal apartment. She dropped out of technical college and became a flight attendant. And she met Vladimir Putin when they were in their early 20s. And she at first thought he was quite unremarkable, but then she came to really admire him because he was so unlike other men their age. He didn't drink. He was physically fit. He was disciplined. He was focused. He was decisive. And in a generation that was born after World War II, when there weren't a lot of men around, and the men that were around were kind of broken psychologically, alcoholic. I mean, alcoholism took off like crazy after World War II because of all the trauma people suffered. And he just struck such a contrast that she was like, this is a real man, and I want to cede some of the responsibilities that Russian women have. So when he starts making every single decision for them, and she has absolutely no agency in the relationship, she really finds it comforting and reassuring because she doesn't feel like she's carrying everything. But then, of course, quickly, once they actually do get married, after he strings her along for 3 years, once they do have kids, she realizes it's all completely on her.
In fact, the most disturbing story is then she was in a car accident and wakes up in the hospital and...
Sure. Vladimir Putin is called. He's now the second man in the city. This is now post-communist St. Petersburg. He races over to the hospital. They're like, oh, she's going to be fine. And he says, okay, and leaves without seeing her, which is just incredible.
Which
in the worst way. But to me, it was so him, right? It was before he was really in the public eye, and the kind of the coldness, the cruelness, the withholding of warmth and affection, the little things we see him do, these little power plays, like when he made the Pope wait 45 minutes. With Lyudmila, he was late to every single date by about an hour and a half, and she still came back for more.
And why did she put up with this?
Well, because men were so scarce after the war, and this really traumatized Russian women who were also being told that they have to get married young and have children young because the Soviet government started telling them this because they needed to replace all the people they had killed about 50 million people that were killed in just 30 years. So there was this obvious absence of men, of eligible men to marry, and it was just like, I'll take him.
So then let's go to the present day. You're right. 100 years after Kollontai and Lenin railed against traditional, economically motivated marriage as a prison for Russian women, it had become their ultimate fantasy. And the evidence of that is in other chapters in the book where you talk about these wives of oligarchs, these former wives of oligarchs, and this mad, I don't know what to call it, like Hunger Games match for these men. How did that happen?
So what happened is the Soviet government, in fighting part of one world war and all of a Second World War, a civil war, having mass famines and putting down peasant rebellions and having mass political repressions, killed a lot of men. By the end of 1945, there were so few men in some places that there would be 19 of them for every 100 women. And at the same time, the Soviet Union really wanted a baby boom, the kind that the U.S. was having, because they needed to, as they said, replace the dead. And there were villages in Russia where only one man came back from the war, and his wife would pass her husband around so that the other women in the village could become mothers as well. So this combination of the state telling women they need to become mothers, that this is their, unlike what Kollontai was saying, that their main role in life, their sole purpose in life was to become mothers. When there were so few men around, how do you do that? So it creates this mismatch between supply and demand.
But you also write about the connection to the way wealth is achieved in Russia, and just this tremendous sort of economic dislocations that have occurred since the fall of communism. Would you talk, which are two different stories, but they're kind of related. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Like the drinking, right? The drinking, it doesn't come from nowhere.
That's right. So basically, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, with it collapsed the teetering Soviet economy. Factories closed, mines closed, and parts of the Soviet government closed, and men and women responded very differently. Men said, I was a factory foreman, or I was an engineer. I will not do lower status work. I'm going to sit around and be sad and complain and wait for work of my status, of my station to come back online. And the women didn't have that option. And they took to drink because they were depressed and, stressed out. The women didn't have that option because for the last 50 years, parenthood had become motherhood. Motherhood became all of parenthood. Fathers weren't expected to father their children and parent them in any way. So women didn't have this option, and they had to work really hard, wash floors, schlep rags from Turkey to sell in markets, chop chicken parts to keep their families fed, while the men just lay down, took to drink, and drank themselves to death, which again exacerbated this perceived shortage of men. And at the same time, there was this new oligarchic class coming into being, and they were all men. And they had such fantastical wealth that, plus all the imagery coming in from the West, there was this idea of wouldn't it be wild and amazing to be a stay-at-home wife and a mom? So instead of being a Soviet woman who has to work full-time, do 7 hours of housework per day, and take care of the kids full-time while the man just maybe works, the idea was, well, can I just be a mom?
These pictures of Putin, bare-chested, shirtless on horseback, or Putin, fishing or playing hockey, where magically he scores all the goals. In the West, we think this is hilarious.
Yeah.
We're like, what is this? What's this guy? You were saying that in Russia, this is actually part of his allure, and that it's actually directed at the women.
Yes.
Because the women find this, comforting in a way. Like, say more about that.
Yeah. So because Russian men are seen as so useless as these kind of overgrown man children that the women have to take care of in addition to their actual children. They can't be trusted with the money. They earn more than the women, but can they be trusted to bring it home? Can they be trusted not to drink through everything, not to get into a crazy car accident or just drop dead at work? Russian men die so much younger than Russian women. They're in such terrible health and in such terrible shape. They smoke, they drink, they eat a lot of mayonnaise salads. And Putin is so not that. He doesn't drink. He exercises regularly and on camera. He makes sure people see it. He makes sure to show people how disciplined he is, how much longer he's lived than the average Russian man. And for a lot of Russian women, he is the man they never had and the man they wish they had, which also goes back to your question about why did Lyudmila Putina stick with him for as long as she did? Because, he was maybe not the nicest partner, but at least he was there and he had this kind of traditional, virile, energetic image, whereas the average Russian man is seen as this drunken, childish slob.
I doubt that Motherland is going to be, a bestseller in Russia. If I don't know that we'll be seeing too many copies in the airport bookstore. But I'm wondering what are people saying about it?
The reaction I'm getting from Russians is actually very positive. A lot of them, the ones that were able to read it in English, didn't know a lot of this history. I didn't know most of this history, and it's just not taught. What Russians are taught, what I was taught studying Soviet and Russian history here in the U.S. is a very male-centric history. And I didn't know about Alexandra Kollontai, for example, until I started researching this book. A lot of, I kept giving chapters to my parents to read, to ask them, or to other friends from the kind of Russia sphere to read, like, did you know any of this? Or am I just repeating something everybody else has said? And most people didn't know any of this. So people are pleasantly surprised and have found it illuminating. But we're working on getting it translated into Russian, so at least it can get into the country digitally. But, I have a friend who runs a publishing house in Russia, and she said there's no way with the word feminist. And it's not because of the way Putin is portrayed, but because it has feminist on the cover. And she said, at a time when Susan Sontag's books are being seized by police from stores, there's no way.
Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Now, at least 70 school shootings have happened across the United States this year. Unbelievable. It is a story that most Americans know all too well, sadly, with each incident as disturbing and traumatic as the last. Feeling increasingly desensitized to these harrowing headlines, CBS News correspondent Steve Hartman channeled his frustration into this powerful new documentary, All the Empty Rooms, exploring the grief and loss experienced by families of young victims through the bedrooms they leave behind.
It's a lovely day.
Her room, no, that was her safe place.
Brian Milberger lost his daughter Gracie in the 2019 Saugus High School shooting, and he joined Steve Hartman and Hari Srinivasan to talk about this painful yet moving portrait of America.
Bianna, thanks. Steve Hartman, Brian Milberger, thank you both for joining us. Steve, let me start with you. You have been working on this project for 7 years on the side of your day job, and I guess you have been to so many of these school shootings, the stories the week after. Why do this project?
Well, the project was born out of kind of frustration that I felt that the country was growing numb to the school shooting epidemic. And I was growing numb, and if I'm to be really honest, I guess I could say that I just didn't care as much as I once did. There'd be a school shooting and it would make news for a little while and everybody was moving on. And I didn't like seeing that in myself, and I didn't like seeing it in the country. So I started thinking, what could I do to possibly shake people out of that numbness? And that this project was born from that feeling.
I don't know if you felt this as a reporter, but I remember being in the living rooms after the Newtown tragedy of the parents, and it was so devastating. And I thought, for sure, that was going to be it. That's the end. There couldn't be anything more tragic than all these children that were gone down. Okay, we're going to have legislation. We're going to stop this. But as the statistics in your film point out, it hasn't stopped.
No. I don't think I ever really thought that. I know that was kind of the mood in the country for maybe a few months afterwards. But, the whole debate, the gun debate and all the arguments, they haven't led us anywhere. I mean, I think Sandy Hook is proof of that, and the statistics are proof of that. And I'm hoping that this film can serve as kind of a new beginning, a fresh start, because we can't begin to solve the problem, I don't think, until we fully feel the weight of it.
Yeah.
And this film definitely lets people feel the weight of it. And I hope people watch it with an open mind, and they don't have to worry about being lectured about what, guns or whatever the solution is. It's just let's start back at the beginning and let's care again. Let's restore our empathy.
Brian, your daughter Gracie was killed at the Saugus High School shootings back in November of 2019, and you are one of the parents that shared their stories and allowed Steve to just literally be in her room. Tell us, I guess, our audience a little bit about Gracie.
Yeah, Gracie was our youngest daughter. So we had 2 boys and then Gracie. She was a vivacious, funny, just life of the party type of little girl. Ever since she was little, she had a camera phone in her hand or a camera of some sort, always filming herself and entertaining. And as she got older, she continued doing that. And she just lived life to its fullest.
Hi.
She was the life of the party. She brought a lot of joy to us. I feel like she was a gift from God telling us what true joy looked like, and that's what she represented for us.
I guess one of the first things that people will wonder is, why did you keep her room the same way?
It was the first place we went to when we got home from the hospital that morning. And it was a place we spent a lot of time in the days and weeks after. It started symbolizing, the life that was in so many ways. It was a place where we went to feel Gracie's presence in so many ways. It had, her personality, peppered throughout the entire place. As the years went on, we cleaned it up and straightened it up and things like that. It was quite a disaster the day of, like any teenager room might be. Clothes strawn everywhere. All the 17 outfits she might have tried on that week, planning for her weekend and so forth. But it was a place of peace, a place of solace where we could go and just feel her presence and be with her. For so many. Up until we recently moved, my wife every morning would open her door, Gracie's door, and say, "Good morning, sweet pea." And every night, tell her good night and close the door, as if she was still there in so many ways. So it was just a welcome opportunity to have Steve and them experience some of that with us.
Steve, you've now had the opportunity to stand in these places. For someone who might not have ever done that, give us a sense of what that's like, what kind of emotions hit you.
Well, the rooms many times they're frozen in time, and they're little details. They're little details that stand out that show just how quickly that life was extinguished. A lot of tasks left undone, like the toothpaste tube with the cap still off. Homework strewn on the floor. I'll pick that up later. I'll do that later. And later never came. So for me, standing in the rooms just reminds me of how quickly the life was taken And also allows, for some reason, I see my own kids in all these rooms because, there's a sameness to them, and that like sometimes the same little trinkets that they collect are in my kids' rooms. And I think what sets the film apart is that, you show the picture of a beautiful child that was killed in a school shooting, and you can easily dismiss, oh, that's somebody else's child. That's not me. But you look around the room, and I feel like it becomes your kid's room. And I think that maybe that's part of the reason that the film is resonating as deeply as it is because we finally have a chance to put ourselves in those shoes.
Brian, being kind of in this weird place where the spotlight is on you for maybe it's a day or a week, and then you have Steve Hartman kind of reaching out in this sort of very long-term project and asking you, what made you want to say yes?
It was, we were a little apprehensive at first. We received his letter in April of 24, and Cindy and I talked about it at length. We had a desire in our hearts to move out of California. We've been wanting to move for a while since the shooting, and we couldn't come to peace and come to grips with things. And we'd often thought, like, how would we go about this? Would we film the room ourselves, get a professional photographer, recreate it where we land next and things like that? And it was, kind of a blessing from God, as my wife always says to Steve, like, you're an angel from heaven, and coming into our life and giving us this opportunity to film her room and to get really intimate with it so that people can experience that sacred space really gave us a sense of peace. And so when they came in June and started filming, we just felt this complete peace come over us, that we just felt like this was meant to be, that we were supposed to share Gracie's room with the world and Gracie's personality.
And if nothing else comes from this, Brian, we've all invested a lot of time and effort into this film, and if nothing else comes from it, then you guys being able to, move and set the room aside, good by me.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it definitely made us feel that, I think I asked the question in the documentary, if the room goes away, does she go away?
Yeah.
And we can honestly say that's not the case. She does not go away when that room goes away. She's still alive and well in our hearts. In the film, you get to see her personality, and, we still experience her every single day of our lives.
Brian, Steve comes with a photographer, Lou Bope, and they take photos, and really almost intimate portraits of things that are in Gracie's room. Tell us, if you can, what are some of the things that were maybe revealed in these photos that you've been walking by but noticed in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I'd never seen such a responsible and respectful individual as I saw in Lou, walking into these rooms. I didn't catch it till the movie came out and we saw the premiere of it. And, he would take his shoes off before he would go in there just to honor the sacred place of the rooms. And, he got in there and, we showed him around a little bit, but then we left him to be. And he just sat there and looked at the room in different angles and views, and got on his belly and looked under the bed and under things, and took light of things that you probably don't capture, as much when you're just walking by it day in and day out, because the way, he just photographs things. He's just amazing. I would say, when, we got Gracie's shoes back that she was wearing the day of the shooting, and they sit on the stand where her clothes and outfits were still hung up for the remainder of that week. She had 2 outfits still picked out for Friday that week. And the shoes are on there, and he takes a picture of the shoes at such an angle that I can see moments of that day in a very surreal way that I never noticed before. And that's just because he's so up and close with the photo.
Yeah.
He captured the personality of Gracie throughout. Definitely. The trinkets she had in her drawer, and the notes she had to her future self, and the pillows on the bed, and her big stuffed dog that she had there, and things like that.
And capturing that personality for me, And I think the families too was really fun. I mean, it seems strange to say that you're going into this place that seems so bitterly sad, but there were laughs, you know. I think anybody who loses a child under any circumstance, they want the world to remember their child. And there's usually a lot of laughs that go along with that. So we actually had a good time, and it was just fun to learn about the kids and share their stories and just doing our part to make sure these kids are not forgotten.
Steve, when you did this project, I mean, this was not blessed by CBS News. You say in the documentary that you really kind of kept it hidden from your bosses until it was pretty much done. Why?
Because, you know, I'm the feel-good news guy. You know, I do the stories that come at the end of the newscast that are meant to restore your faith in humanity. So this project was way off brand for me. It was one of those better to ask forgiveness than permission kind of things.
There seems to be also, as you kind of point out, a tension in how you approach the job, the assignments that you were given to try to find that silver lining after a horrible week at the end of a mass shooting, and you just saying, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, for a while, anytime there was any mass shooting, because I was always, my stories can't come at the end of the CBS Evening News, and you know, we want to leave people on a positive note. So I was told to find some positive angle to this school shooting, as crazy as that sounds. And there are things, there are the hero, teacher, or the community coming together, but just with this subject, I just didn't want to do it anymore. You know, I didn't want to do any more sort of feel good stories about, you know, a school shooting. I just couldn't do it anymore. I had to go in a different direction.
Brian, one of the things that you share with Steve is a box where you discovered that she wrote notes to her future self.
Yeah.
And what do those notes mean to you now?
You know, they were an interesting find, to say the least, when we first found them originally. And, you know, they're kind of surreal because she's writing letters to her future self. She wrote one, you know, graduating 8th grade, starting high school, driving, and going off to college. She was able to accomplish 2 of them. So when you read the ones that she didn't get to accomplish, you're a bit sad that she didn't get to enjoy those experiences in life. But at the same time, you saw that she had the wherewithal to even think about writing to her future self. And in a sense, she's almost writing to us. There's an interesting component to that. She said to herself, she wrote a poem, and I've got it tattooed on my arm now. You only have one life to live, so why not live it great, real, and fill it with memories and experiences? And that accompanied those letters that she wrote to her future self. And it just kind of gave us a sense of, she's telling us like how we need to embrace life and live going forward. And I think that was the takeaway we got from that, for sure.
One of the things that's fascinating is the ripple effects of how this sadness not just deals with for the parents, but also the siblings. What has it been like tolerating, bearing this grief while you still have to be a dad to kids who are also grieving, but kids who are trying to process this and they need their mom and dad full-time as well?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was something, you know, when I'm working on writing a book right now, and I'm kind of been reflecting on the day of the shooting and the days after. I was talking to Heather, who was sitting next to my side, a friend of my wife's, and she was recalling, she goes, you immediately went from, you know, down on your hands and knees crying to father mode. You know, you got to now contact your boys. You got to start calling the family members and take action. So I think we're just innately wired to do that. And I think that's what keeps me going. You know, I'm sure this is hard on many families when they go through a tragedy like this and losing a child. But I immediately just thought to myself, I've got these 2 other boys I've got to take care of. I've got a wife who I need to be there for. And it's something that we do every day. You know, I mean, we're always reaching out to our boys. We're spread across the country now, and, you know, they're doing well, but they're still dealing with it as well, just like we are.
Steve, you were able to capture a couple of the siblings as well. And you can see on camera how deeply affected the siblings are by this.
Yeah, the filmmaker, Josh Seftel, he interviewed the boys of one of the families. And, I was in the other room when he was doing that interview, and it was hard. It's hard to listen to because I don't know. You hear often from the grieving parents, but it's not often that you hear what this whole experience is like for the siblings. And again, I'm just wired to sort of put myself in those shoes and think about my other kids and how devastated they would be. So yeah, the film is full of it's emotional, and that's one of the more emotional moments in the film. But the film also there's laughs, there's giggles at things, and I think ultimately through it all, I feel great hope at the end of this film. I feel like that we can find a better way, and I just feel like maybe this might just be the beginning, and I certainly hope it is.
Brian, Stephen Liu gave you and all the families a book of photos. What did that book mean?
It was that invitation that it's okay to move. Is what it was. We've got that takeaway now of her room that, with amazing photography, as you've seen in the film, that, we can look at anytime we want and come back to that room. So that gave us that invitation to move away. And I wanted to add one thing. When they had reached out about doing this film, Steve and I had a conversation because I get contacted a lot, and a lot of these things have to do with the polarizing and political side of gun violence or what have you. And we talked about two things in particular. One is we didn't want it to be one side or the other. This is a human issue we've got, especially in our country. And the second side was we really wanted to draw that empathy out in the viewer. We wanted them to step into the rooms, as Steve says, and feel some of that pain that we experience every single day of our lives, but the hope that this maybe inspires some change in some positive way.
The film is called All the Empty Rooms. It's available now on Netflix. Brian Muehlberger, Steve Hartman, thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Trump's assault on higher education landed a big fish. Columbia University has agreed to pay over $220 million to settle their fight. Meanwhile, his administration's attack on the media is in full swing, with Congress approving drastic public broadcasting cuts and lawsuits that keep on coming. Just a day after CBS's decision to cancel the #1 late-night show with Stephen Colbert sent shockwaves, the president hit the Wall Street Journal with an unprecedented $20 billion libel suit. Hari Srinivasan unpacks all of this and the state of freedom of speech in America with David Enrich, Deputy Investigations Editor at the New York Times.
Christian, thanks. David Enrich, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a book recently called Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. At the core of your book is a Supreme Court case that most of our audience are probably not familiar with. Most Americans aren't familiar with. 1964, New York Times versus Sullivan. Encapsulate that. Why is it such an important case?
In a nutshell, it established that if you're a powerful person, an elected official, a billionaire, someone like that, in order to successfully sue someone for defamation, you need to not only prove that you were defamed, so that someone got a fact wrong about you and that hurt your reputation. You need to go further than that. You also need to prove that whoever spoke or wrote that defamatory falsehood did so either knowing that what they were saying was false, so in other words, lying, or they did it with reckless disregard for the truth. And the Supreme Court created that high bar, knowing that it was really high and it would be hard to overcome. And the reason was that they wanted journalists and just members of the public in general to have the breathing room to know that they could criticize or interrogate or scrutinize powerful people in society without worrying that if they made an innocent mistake, a good faith error, that could subject them to basically bottomless, endless liability. And so that the Supreme Court decision in New York Times versus Sullivan really opened up this golden age of investigative journalism because it allowed people, reporters and others to pursue ambitious targets and really try to uncover wrongdoing and hold people accountable without worrying that an innocent slip up could cause terrible financial damage for them.
You go through a number of different challenges, the cases that have been played out, and you spend quite a bit of time on the case of Gawker and Hulk Hogan. For people a little unfamiliar with that, Peter Thiel, who we think of as a tech titan, was the force that was funding that. Why was that case so important?
Well, it became really important because Hulk Hogan won this lawsuit, basically bankrupted Gawker. And on its face, that was, you could understand why Hulk Hogan had sued Gawker. Gawker had published this sex tape of Hulk Hogan. It invaded his privacy. Easy to understand that. It turned out after the verdict that Peter Thiel had been in the background financing this. And he wasn't financing it because he liked Hulk Hogan. He was financing it because he had decided years earlier that he wanted to destroy Gawker because he was very unhappy with the website's coverage of him personally and of Silicon Valley in general. And the fact that Thiel had masterminded and bankrolled this plot sent real shockwaves through the media world because it showed that one billionaire with some patience and creativity, here was a playbook for them to basically kneecap news organizations whose views or whose journalism they didn't like. And I think for journalists, that was a very scary prospect that one angry man could basically destroy you. I think on the other hand, people who like to file such lawsuits and don't like the way they're covered in the media, this was a real moment of celebration. And people like Donald Trump saw this verdict and saw the outcome of it. And it was just, I think, really inspiring to them.
Now, is there this sort of reaction that, well, not just because Peter Thiel did it, but let me go ahead and sue the institution? Because if it's an institution like the New York Times, sure, they've got a fleet of lawyers and they can defend themselves. But if it's a smaller publication or just a single writer, they probably don't have the resources.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And that's one of the real things I spent a lot of time tracking as I reported and wrote this book was that, I sit at the New York Times. I used to work at the Wall Street Journal. Those are big news outlets that have the resources and kind of the wherewithal to defend themselves, not only from lawsuits, but from legal threats that journalists often receive before they publish a big story. What I found, though, is that these threats and lawsuits are being used increasingly against smaller news organizations and independent journalists that have a lot less resources to fight back with. And the impact of that, and first of all, it's a deliberate effort, I found, often by rich and powerful people at either the national or sometimes the local level as well, to just shut down critical speech about them, and including journalism, but by no means limited to journalism. This is a tactic used against activists, just community members, things like that as well. And it's not just politicians doing it, it's big companies as well. And the tactics are often effective, and they lead journalists, news organizations, lawyers to really start pulling punches because they are faced with a really difficult choice between standing up to these legal threats or these lawsuits, which often do not have a firm basis in the law, but standing up to them can imperil you financially. And on the other hand, it's often easier and kind of financially rational, I think, to just pick a less controversial and a less litigious target. But the result of that is often that you are essentially engaging in self-censorship. That means that important stories aren't covered, wrongdoing doesn't get exposed, people aren't held to account for their actions. And that's the role that journalism is supposed to play in the society, going back hundreds of years to the formation of this country. And so I think it's a really potentially severe problem.
Well, what has happened in this second Trump administration now? There seems to be tactically a very different approach that the administration is taking now versus the first time around.
Yeah, I mean, the first administration now looks like a bit of a warm-up act for what we're seeing in the second administration. And Trump's rhetoric has gotten increasingly incendiary. But I think more important than that, his actions speak louder than his words, and his actions are really profound in a lot of ways. And it's a whole range of stuff. I mean, and he's suing news organizations. He is threatening news organizations. That's kind of the plain vanilla stuff. I mean, he is kicking news outlets out of the White House, restricting how they can cover things because he does not like their choice of language or the way they've written about things. The White House is asserting control over which news organizations and which journalists can travel with the president, can have access to the Oval Office. They have gutted, the administration has gutted long-standing news organizations like Voice of America. There's obviously been a widespread effort, not just in the White House, but in Congress as well, to strip organizations like PBS and NPR and their member stations of funding. And, these are all things that I think have been on, or at least some of them have been on the conservative agenda for years. But I do not think it's a coincidence that we have a president who, in an administration that is really hell-bent on demonizing the media and avoiding the scrutiny that the media would normally bring to a very polarizing and controversial administration. And they're actually getting what they want, not just in terms of the actions they're taking, but legislatively as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's clear there's a lot more substantive, and I think from a media standpoint, potentially dangerous than what we saw the first time around.
Just a point of information and full disclosure, the conversation that our audience is watching right now is produced by a public media station. So we are in ways part of this story. You wrote a fascinating piece recently, not just about the politics and the press, but really just about corporations as well. And you focused in on United Healthcare. Tell our audience a little bit about kind of the tactics that United Healthcare is using now to basically quash public dissent.
Yeah. Well, United Health is one of the, I would say, most controversial companies in the country right now. It's facing enormous criticism for many of its business practices. People are really angry at them. And it have been going to platforms like TikTok and YouTube and to criticize the company. And since the murder of one of their top executives last December, United Health has gotten much more aggressive in fighting back against this. And they've done things like basically threatening to sue a doctor who posted a video on TikTok that criticized the company. They've gone to streaming platforms like Amazon Prime and Vimeo and pushed those platforms to remove material that was critical of the company. They've gone after local journalists and people working at community news organizations. And the list kind of goes on here. And I think one of the things, and to some extent, these tactics are indeed working. And there are platforms like Prime Video and Vimeo removed things at the request of United Health. And it leads to a real kind of rising tide of self-censorship that insulates not just politicians, but also big, powerful companies like United Health from criticism and from scrutiny at the exact moment when that scrutiny and accountability, I think, is most needed.
So, for the record, a spokesperson for United Health in your story was quoted saying the truth matters, and there's a big difference between criticism and irresponsibly omitting facts and context. When others get it wrong, we have an obligation to our customers, employees, and other stakeholders to correct the record, including by making our case in court when necessary. I want to ask specifically about, say, for example, the Walt Disney Company that settled a lawsuit against the Trump administration had brought against ABC News, and now the Paramount Corporation that settled in a different way for kind of a different reason. What are those? Why are those important? Because technically, you could look as a bean counter and say, this is just part of doing business. I'm just doing a cost-benefit analysis. I don't want the administration on my back. So what if I just write a $15 million check to a presidential library? Versus saying I'm going to stand up for press freedoms?
Well, look, this is a feature, for better or for worse, of having major companies owning news organizations. And I think it is to a certain extent the bean counters making the decision here. For a company like Disney that has tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, cutting a check for $15 million, so a lawsuit against ABC News goes away, is quite possibly a rational thing to do. And same for Paramount, which has a multi-billion-dollar merger pending that needs federal approval. I think the problem is that it sets a precedent that shows journalists that their parent companies do not have their back. And it sends a message to not only to Trump and his administration, but any other rich and powerful person anywhere in the world, or at least anywhere in the country, that it's open season on journalists and that these attacks can work and that they are working. And it encourages people to further weaponize the legal system to crack down on companies, news organizations, and journalists whose coverage is critical or unfavorable. And again, I think the most important thing here is that the lawsuits that Trump has been filing against ABC, against CBS, against the Des Moines Register, against the Wall Street Journal, most recently, they appear to lack legal merit based on the substance of the complaints and the underpinning interpretation of the law. And yet you're seeing these companies like Disney and like Paramount basically bending a knee to Trump just to make this stuff go away. And that's exactly what he wants. And, when I talk to people in his camp about this, they celebrate these victories and say very openly, I think, that this is emboldening them and that the tactics are working and that they're going to keep using these tactics going forward.
Most recently, Paramount, the parent company that owns CBS, has the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. They announced that they were going to finish the Late Show with a multi-decade long brand. Their rationale for it is that just financially it doesn't make sense anymore. And I wonder, now there's a lot of speculation wondering how much of this is business versus how much of this is, silencing a critic in Stephen Colbert, especially days after he criticized the very bargain that Paramount struck with the government.
Yeah, and I don't know what the truth is here, but it's impossible to ignore the timing of it. And it certainly, at the very least, it's quite a coincidence that shortly after Colbert criticizes the settlement with Trump, his show is canceled. And the way I look at it is that CBS and Paramount have resolved the lawsuit that Trump filed by paying off Trump. But there's another party to this, and they still need to get the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to approve this multi-billion-dollar deal. And it's pending. And so sending a signal to the Trump administration that you are going to shape programming in a way that will be less objectionable to the White House, that does send a signal to the White House that you're playing ball. And certainly Trump has stated publicly since the show was canceled that he applauds this and he takes credit for it. Now, I don't know if that's actually what happened here, but that's certainly the way the White House seems to be interpreting it.
Yeah. There is a lawsuit that is now been filed against Rupert Murdoch for $10 billion against the Wall Street Journal for a story that they published just last week about Jeffrey Epstein and whether or not the president had written this kind of tawdry birthday note, et cetera. But my question to you is, what happens inside a newsroom, considering you've worked at both the Journal and the Times now, when there is a lawsuit like this, at least at a place where you do have a fleet of in-house and outside counsel that can help defend your rights?
Well, I mean, what happens is that your lawyers and basically start circling the wagons and trying to figure out what is happening, what documents need to be preserved, who might need to be deposed in the future. And on the surface, it's like not a problem because these lawsuits tend to lack merit. It's clear in the Journal's case that assuming they did not make up this letter that Trump supposedly wrote to Epstein, that they're on pretty solid legal ground because the truth is always a defense against defamation claims. But look, being sued by anyone, and much less the president of the United States, is a scary prospect. And I don't know how the reporters at the Journal are feeling, but I can tell you how I've felt when I've been sued over much lesser things. And it's a terrible feeling. It's scary, and it makes you question what you should be reporting on in the future, even if you know intellectually and in your head that that you're on safe ground. And so I think that is one of the intents of lawsuits like this, is to get journalists thinking twice about whether they really want to speak critically about Trump or his allies, because that might result in legal action, which has the potential to drag on for years. And even if you work for a big institution like the Wall Street Journal, that's a cloud that's going to be hanging over your head and causing you to lose sleep at night.
One of the things that I found interesting about your book is that it's as much a story about this court case and the kind of legal battles as it just is about just money and power and the way that power is exerted in so many different ways that we're not necessarily seeing the through line. Help our audience understand how kind of power is transacted and why it's so important in this tussle.
Well, look, I mean, we right now have a strong First Amendment. We have precedents that have interpreted the First Amendment in a very robust way that offers a lot of protection. But there are a lot of people with a lot of money and power that are on this very well-coordinated campaign to roll back a lot of those protections. And that's an expensive proposition, and it requires a lot of time and energy and money. And what I found that's happening, and really all over the country, is that there are a lot of lawyers, activists, academics, politicians who are working in lockstep, often through well-financed organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society, to really not only change public opinion, but change the opinion of the few people that really have the power to alter the law, which are the justices of the United States Supreme Court. And the goal here is, in large part, to roll back New York Times versus Sullivan so that it becomes not only easier for powerful people to sue news organizations and members of the public, but also so that the kind of the risk-taking calculus inside a news organization or even a member of the public changes, and that it becomes riskier and potentially much more expensive to speak critically or even to scrutinize or investigate powerful people and institutions. And that can further kind of tilt the playing field in favor of powerful people and organizations and companies, and away from those who are trying in their professional lives or even in their personal lives, trying to speak up what they speak of truth to power. And I think that's a shift that's been underway for a long time, but it's definitely been accelerating in the past several years.
New York Times journalist and author of the book Murder, the Truth, David Enrich, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.